All right, welcome everybody to Chapter 2, Biological Foundations. So in this chapter, we're talking basically about puberty, which is this period of life during which an individual becomes capable of sexual reproduction. We have hormones that are regulated by the endocrine system that lead to physical changes. It's important to note that during puberty, no new hormones are produced, no new body systems develop. It's just a different level of hormones that create this biological changes at puberty. So, what's happening? Puberty is really regulated by the endocrine system, and the initiation of puberty takes place in the hypothalamus here in the brain. And that's where the hormone changes begin. Gonadotropin releasing hormone begins to be released during puberty once a threshold of body fat is reached. So as individuals get older and they get a certain level of body fat, that pretty much starts this process, which is why individuals who are very, very thin may have a delay in beginning puberty. So then these gonadotropin releasing hormones reach the pituitary gland, also here at the base of the brain, and they start to produce the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and those are then released. And in response to those two hormones, FSH and LH, the gonads, which are the sex glands, either ovaries or testes in female or male, start to increase their production of sex hormones. And so we have estrogens that are produced. The most important estrogen is estradiol, and then androgens, the most important being testosterone. Androgens are also produced by the adrenal glands here, the base of the kidneys, and those androgens have the same impact as androgen released by the testes, and becomes a feedback loop between all of these systems that sort of ramp up this hormone production for puberty. And you can see here that in terms of testosterone and estrogen, girls and boys are fairly similar in the beginning of puberty in both of these hormones, but you can see that as puberty goes on, boys start to produce much more testosterone compared to girls, and girls tend to produce much more estrogen over time than boys. All right, so 4 major physical changes of puberty that we'll go through: the adolescent changes in body composition, and then development of primary and secondary sex characteristics. So we'll start with the adolescent growth spurt, which is a rapid acceleration in growth, both in height and in weight. And you can see, I like this picture here on the side. This is age in years, and this is height velocity, so centimeters per year. And what you can see is when children are very, very young, infants, they are growing quite a bit. And if you've ever been around an infant, they just are growing constantly, growing out of their clothes. They grow so quickly. And then over time, the velocity of their growth decreases, although it's still very, very high. And then into early childhood, the velocity of growth slows down, right? At 5 years old, 7 years old, 9 years old, it's kind of a slowing down point. And then at puberty, you get this peak again, which is what we call the adolescent growth spurt, where all of a sudden girls and boys are growing much more quickly than they have for many years. And you can also notice here that the average female growth spurt is about 2 years earlier than the average male growth spurt. So girls tend to get taller around 12-ish years old, although there's quite a bit of variability, and boys is more like 14 years old. In terms of the growth spurt, we see asynchronicity, that's uneven growth. We see the extremities growing first before the trunk of the body. And peak height velocity, you can see right here, that's the time in which adolescents are growing most quickly. All right, we also see changes in body composition in terms of relative proportions of body fat and muscle. And it's different for boys and girls. Boys tend to, and you can see here, increase during puberty their proportion of body muscle compared to girls. And girls tend to increase their relative proportion of body fat. And this is something that we'll talk about in this class, leading to perhaps some difficulties, emotional, psychological issues, because just at this time when adolescents are maybe becoming more aware of the ideal body type, and I have ideal in quotes by looking in magazines and social media, etc., their body types, particularly girls, are changing in terms of increases in body fat, and it's almost as if they're moving farther away from that quote unquote ideal, right? And so we need to do a really good job of showing adolescents and having them know that a lot of what they see in the media, on magazines, social media can be, might be photoshopped and is not necessarily a realistic image, but we can start to see body image issues at this age, and maybe triggered a little bit by this change in normal body composition. All right, other changes, primary sex characteristics start to develop, and that's the production of eggs and sperm, the development of sex organs. So females get their first menstrual period, in which a mature egg or an ovum is released every 28 days or so. And spermarchy is the first production of sperm in males. So during this time, male and female reproductive anatomy is changing, and the body is preparing for sexual reproduction. In males, the penis and testes grow. Females release an ovum with each monthly cycle, although females don't start ovulating at their very first menstruation. Also, we see the development of secondary sexual characteristics. These are body changes that are not directly related to reproduction. We measure this in boys and girls by using what's called Tanner staging, and these changes include growth of pubic hair, changes in the appearance of sex organs, and breast development. Other changes in physical functioning during puberty happen as well. The heart size doubles, heart rate falls. Children have a much higher heart rate. By age 17, the average girl's heart rate is 5 beats faster than the average boy's. Also, the lung vital capacity, so the amount of air that can be exhaled after a deep breath, increases rapidly, increases more for boys versus girls. And at this time, boys overtake girls in physical strength during puberty. All right. One thing to consider during this time is obesity, which is exceeding a specific body mass index, or BMI. And we find about 20% of American adolescents are obese. You could see here, comparing other countries to the United States, boys and girls have a much higher percentage of 15-year-olds who are overweight or obese. And you can also see that this has changed over time. with an increase in obesity over time. And so you might think about what is leading to the cause of this increase in overweight and obesity. Could be the increase in fast food in our diets, our lifestyle being more automobile oriented versus walking around, a decline in physical activity from middle childhood to adolescence. Middle childhood, individuals are more likely to be out playing around, bike riding, playing sports, things like that. Adolescence, more typical of a time to be at home, be in your room, be on social media, your telephone, things like that. And perhaps the influence of soft drinks and junk food machines in schools. Definitely something to keep in mind or to think about, since it's such a noticeable increase. And so our peak physical functioning really happens during emerging adulthood, so in the early 20s, basically. Kind of depressing for those of us who have passed our early 20s. But you can see here that peak bone mass is reached in your 20s, your maximum oxygen uptake peaks in the early 20s, cardiac output peaks in about 25, reaction time is fastest in your 20s. So I guess it's all downhill from there, although that's awfully depressing. So, but that's kind of our peak physical functioning. All right, variations in the timing and tempo of puberty. There's no average age at onset or duration of puberty. It can be quite variable for individual people. And there's no relation between the age at which puberty begins and the rate of development. So just because the individual starts puberty early doesn't mean it will, they'll go through the stages much more quickly or much more slowly than somebody else. All right, and puberty begins earlier in cultures where good nutrition and medical care are widely available. So you can see here in this bottom chart, we've got earliest age of first menstruation in girls starting earlier in more high SES kind of countries compared to lower. And then within countries, adolescent girls from affluent families, again, tend to menstruate earlier than girls from poorer families. All right. So there does seem to be this relationship between earlier puberty and higher socioeconomic status. Reaction range, that's a term that describes that genes establish a range of possible development. So when, in this case, will an individual go through puberty, and then the environment determines exactly where it takes place within that range. So it's a combination of nature and nurture, which we're going to be talking quite a lot about this semester. And then a secular trend. This is a term for a change in the characteristics of a population over time, and we have a secular trend for the age of first menstruation, such that over time the age has decreased. And you can see in the 1950s, the age for first menstruation was almost over 17 years old, and now in many countries it's 13 or even younger than that. All right. Cultural responses to puberty. Many cultures have some sort of ritual to initiate an individual into adolescence. You can read a little bit more about this in your book. For females, it's a lot more clear. Usually first menstruation is the mark that an individual, a female, has entered into puberty. Whereas for males, there's not really a particular biological event. But these puberty rites typically require a male to display some kind of courage, strength, endurance, to show that they have moved into adolescence. What about what happens between parents and adolescents during puberty? And we'll talk more about this as we move through the class. But in terms of American majority culture, there's less, the relations between parents and adolescents become cooler. There's not as much tight-knit feelings. You might see conflict increasing between parents and adolescents during this time, and physical closeness becomes less likely. And that's not the same in other cultures. In fact, in other cultures, girls often grow closer to mothers during this time of puberty. And of course, as we go through the class and talk about culture, when we say American majority culture, this is an average, right? And doesn't mean that it holds for everybody in every family. Psychological and psychosocial consequences of puberty. There's been a lot of research, which is really interesting, on individuals who go through puberty early versus late. So early matures versus late matures in terms of their psychological well-being, their self-concept, self-esteem, drug use, etc. And we see a different pattern for boys than for girls. So in terms of early or late maturation in boys, if there's an early maturing boy, the pros of that, the individual tends to be more popular, have better self-esteem, perhaps more responsible, cooperative, and sociable later in life. So these are boys who go through puberty early on. And remember, when boys go through puberty, they get taller, they get more muscles, and so that typically leads to better self-esteem, since they're moving in the direction of, again, what is stereotypically associated with more ideal physical attributes. The cons of early maturation: we see more drug and alcohol use, maybe precocious sexual activity. They may be hanging out with older individuals because they look older, and may get involved in some of these activities, perhaps before they're even kind of psychologically or cognitively ready for it. However, compared to early maturing boys, which it's typically leads to some positive outcomes, early maturing girls have more difficulties. Remember that girls go through puberty earlier than boys, right? We said that growth spurt occurs earlier, maybe around 12 years old. So if you're an early maturing girl, you are going through these processes. You would typically be going through them before the boys of your age. But if you're an early maturing girl, you're going through this way before the boys, and typically before the girls as well. And so early maturing girls end up looking very different from their peers. And that can be difficult for individuals at 10, 11, 12 years old, when sometimes it's very hard to be different. So pros of early maturation, boy, this should be with a big question mark, maybe popularity with the boys. Cons of early maturation, we see that girls who go through early puberty tend to be heavier and shorter later in life. And we see earlier sexual activity, lowered self-image, higher rates of depression, eating disorders, anxiety. Why this difference? As I mentioned, this maturational deviance hypothesis, that it's hard to be different from your peers. And if you're an early maturing girl, then you are very different from your peers, right? Because you could be 10 years old, still in elementary school, and going through a growth spurt. These girls may no longer be able to fit into the little tiny desks that they have in some elementary school classrooms, and they just look so and feel so different from their peers. Also, the developmental readiness hypothesis that younger adolescents are less able to cope with changes that come with puberty, right? They don't have the cognitive capacity to deal with what's going on with their bodies in maybe an appropriate way. And then cultural and contextual factors. Again, for females, valuing thinner body types, and we know that during puberty there's this increase in fat that is normal and natural and happens, and so that can lead to lowered self-image, eating disorders, etc. We talked about nature versus nurture a little bit. I'm sure you've talked about it in many of your classes, and it will be a continued theme throughout our semester. But this is the debate over the relative importance of biology versus the environment in human development. And so we'll talk about theory of genotype and environmental effects. And this is the theory that both genetics and environment make essential contributions to human development. But it's a little bit difficult to unravel what part of development is due to genes and what part of our development is due to the environment we experience. And so the genotype, right, these are your genes. This passive genotype leading to environmental effects, it's difficult to separate genetic and environmental influences because parents provide both, right? Parents provide the genotype. You inherit your genes from your biological parents and provide the environment. And so it's a little bit hard to tease that out, although there are studies that we'll talk about this semester, adoption studies and things like that, where we can try to tease apart the effects of genes versus the environment. Now, the idea of an evocative genotype leading to environmental effects. Evocative genotype means the person's inherited characteristics, their genes, evoke certain responses from others in the environment. So think about the genes that someone inherits that leads to their personality or their temperament. And so if they're a very, let's say responsible, quiet, hardworking child, that will evoke certain responses from people around them, right? Probably caring, helpful types of responses. Whereas if a person inherits genes that maybe make them aggressive, temperamental, difficult, that's going to evoke totally different responses from people in their environment. And so that's the idea of an evocative genotype, that it evokes certain responses from others in their environment that can then impact development. And then the idea of an active genotype, again, leading to certain environmental effects. The idea of an active genotype is that people seek out environments that correspond to their genotypic characteristics. So by inheriting certain genes that maybe make an individual have a lot of energy and be very active, well, they are going to seek out maybe being involved in sports or being involved in, finding kids in the neighborhood to run around and ride bikes with. And again, that will then impact their development versus maybe a child who has inherited genes that they're very interested in music. Well, they might go find or seek out music lessons or ask parents for musical instruments, and then that will impact their development. So as we go through the class, we're going to talk about how somebody's genes impact their environment, either by evocative forces, active forces, and how then the environment will impact their development as well. All right, thank you all very much.